So I got an email a number of months ago from Alana saying, we'd like you to lead a high holiday seminar session. I was really pleased and honored. And then it said, we'd like you to lead it on Israel. And immediately two thoughts ran through my mind, which is, man, they must have asked everybody else. And then the second thought that ran through my mind was, what did I do that she doesn't like me? Because talking about Israel is incredibly difficult. We understand within our pulpits that when we speak publicly about Israel, we are automatically going to get responses from people. We understand when we speak about it privately with people, congregants, friends, whatever, there's a response. You post something online, there is a response. Talking about Israel is an incredibly difficult thing to do right now within our culture, within our society, within the Jewish community, whether as a rabbi or not. And so what I wanted to be able to do in our session is take three different aspects of that struggle, where I, as an American Jew, come when we talk about Israel, talking about it within our political climate here in the United States, either looking at the left or right of that political spectrum. When we talk about Israel as an American Jew, looking at what's going on in Israel in terms of religious life there, and other issues that I bring as an American and as a Jew to the social dynamic that's unfolding in Israel. And then as an American Jew, and as I look upon what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so what I wanted to do is be able to share three different perspectives on each of those different things and open up for conversation and invite us to be able to talk in a place that is safe and that is inclusive and that is a place where we can explore and begin coming to ourselves a sense of comfort as we go and talk about this incredibly controversial yet important and essential topic. So, good morning, everyone. Can we just go around real quick? I mean, I know we're in name tags. Can we just go around real quick to have people just introduce themselves and where you're all from, and you can take the where you're all from, however you wish to take that.
David Sella, Tamar Mansian in Northridge for the past 8 years, but an East Coaster from Portland.
Lisa Hochberg-Miller up in Ventura, up the coast, Temple Beth Torah for the last, I'm going to say this, 21 years. It's good. It's all good.
Sounds very nice. I'm Rabbi Corinne Kovner. I'm originally Canadian, almost all of my life, but the last 20 years I'm a Los Angelino, just up the street from Rabbi Sella. I have my own study group called Beit Kulam. I write for my website. This year is a writing year for me. And I've served the Seabourn line and Holland America line as a cruise rabbi for the important holidays for the last 3 years.
I'm Rabbi Yochanan Mintz. I'm in Las Vegas. I'm Rabbi Emerita, trying very unsuccessfully to be retired from a small Reconstructionist renewal shul.
I'm Rabbi Ann Brenner. I'm a faculty member at AJRCA, and I'm a board member of Olive, and went to HUCs.
I'm Cynthia Minster-Chain. I grew up at TRZ, and I'm a rabbinic student at the Academy for Jewish Religion.
Hello, I'm Dan Shapiro. I'm a Jewish chaplain and Hillel director at Claremont Colleges. I'm originally from New York, but I've been out here in LA for a while now.
I'm Max Chaikin. I am the assistant rabbi at Congregation Colby, West Hollywood.
Daniel Scher, born in Southern California, did everything I could to stay in Southern California, and I'm working at Kehilat Israel in the Palisades.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Hodson. I'm a rabbinic student across the street at Ziegler, and I'm also a rabbinic intern at Temple Aliyah.
Hi, I'm Shayna Chandler, and I'm born in San Francisco. I've lived in Los Angeles for, well, I guess it's 31 years, but as of 2 years ago, I serve Congregation Ner Tamid in San Francisco as their rabbi, and I have a lot of frequent flyer miles as I go out there once a week.
So my name is Jaffe Bernhard, and I'm one of the two rabbis head at Ariel, and I've been here now for a little over 20 years. And in that time of serving in the pulpit, I found that among the topics that is the most difficult to talk about, as I mentioned in the brief introduction, is talking about Israel. And I'm just curious if that is actually reflective of some of the experiences you all had. Ehud and I were talking about it, and Ehud's like, yeah, my congregation's totally cool. So I'm just curious, just very briefly, like, what have been some of your experiences in talking about Israel? What have you shared? What have you tried? What kind of reaction did you sometimes get? Just a little bit of a sense of where people are coming from on this topic.
Yeah, deeply polarizing.
Did you find it mattered what you said? Or is it just polarizing? You say the word Israel, and automatically you can sort of see people like start to brace.
Correct.
Yeah.
I have often asked people to go to the website and read my sermon to hear what I said as opposed to what they thought they heard me say.
Okay.
That's exactly what happens.
All right. Other experiences that people have had? Easy, hard?
I find that beyond the tensing up piece, there's a notion from the get-go that there's not enough time to discuss it. Like,
right.
Regardless of whether or not there's someone who's going to disagree with it, but there's also a time restraint from the beginning because it's too complex, too many people want to process it at their own speeds, there's too many different pieces to it. So it almost becomes a, yes, we'd be willing to talk about it, but it wouldn't work in this space.
Okay.
I live in a city where Sheldon Ellison is very powerful, and I had the pleasure of bringing J Street to Las Vegas. I'm also a member of APAC, Equal Opportunity, but it's really interesting to try to engage people outside of the congregation in the topic of Israel. I also have within our congregation an active member in Voices for Peace. I'm the only congregation that he felt comfortable in, but he's got his own agenda. So it's tough. It's walking on eggshells.
I have two grandchildren who are at university now, and they've been well schooled in Judaism. They studied here at Stephen Wise, as a matter of fact, and they all had their bar and bat mitzvahs here. But I want to be able to give them good answers and to really think this through. Also, for my study group, the first thing that I'm going to be dealing with in September is all 11 clauses of the new nation-state law. And I feel that we need to know what it says, how we feel about it. And as I think about it, there's a lot of cons and there are a lot of pros also, given the current political climate around the world.
What I'm struck is repeatedly how even in San Francisco, it's not an assumption that can be made that everyone is politically one way or the other despite San Francisco's reputation. Even in a small community, how much passion and variety there is from the American political scene as well as what's happening in Israel. But what strikes me over and over again is that the undercurrent, despite the differences, what unites them is love for Israel and wanting so much for this to be what it ought to be and what it isn't.
Right.
And that's at least a place I'm not sure we've been ready to fully explore, starting from that place of sameness, but immediately, yes, the passions are so strong.
I know you speak about Israel, you're going into territory where you know you're going to have people triggered, right? And what happens is when we get triggered, we're no longer actually listening to what the person is saying, but we're already filtering it through what we're feeling. Right? So we have to understand that whenever we talk about Israel, automatically people are going to hear what it is that they want to hear, and they will take in the parts that they can actually sit with. Which means that whenever you speak about Israel, you're screwed. Okay? We have to know when we're going to talk about Israel, we have to know the starting point and what's really possible. I learned this, by the way, in fascinating little experience I had in my synagogue. I gave a talk. It had just been when the first flotilla had tried to kind of breach the the barriers that Israel had set up, and the Israel army boarded one of the flotillas trying to get into Gaza to break the blockade that had been set up, and a couple of people were wounded, a couple of people died. It was a terrible, terrible thing that unfolded. And when I went and addressed the congregation, and I shared with the congregation two things, I had two objects in my hands, and the first one was a metal pole. I had walked around and asked one of the maintenance guys, like, do we have a metal pole? He said, as it happens, we do. So I took the metal pole, and I started the talk by saying, can this kill you? Which the answer is, of course. Right? So Israeli soldiers who board the boat and are attacked with poles, they're fearing for their life. They will defend themselves. They are obligated to defend themselves. And in the course of defending themselves, sadly and tragically, someone got killed. That is awful. But you can't compare, you can't say, well, yeah, but they had guns, because that metal pole will kill you. Right? And then I held up a bottle of spice. I think it was cinnamon. And I said, can this kill you? To which the answer was no. To which I then said to the congregation, okay, so someone needs to explain to me why this is on the list of items that are not permitted to be imported into Gaza Strip. Because if these are the kinds of things that we're blockading, we need to explain why we're doing that. What is the purpose of this? And if we can't explain it, then we have a problem. Because how can we defend what Israel does if we cannot explain it? So I'm thinking to myself, man, threaded it right down the middle, right? I was both, I was defending, right? I stood up there and said, listen, they have a right to, they need to defend themselves, but I also pointed out, but there are questions at least that we should ask. Okay, so literally we finished saying, the amen to the hamotzi, okay, before, okay, just swamped by people. Right? How could you say that about Israel?
Which one? Which side?
Well, yeah, I'm like, well, wait, what do you mean? How could you attack Israel that way? What do you mean? I spent the first half actually defending and pointing out that even if the optics don't look right, they still, what do you, so that went on for half an hour. And then actually, when I got to shul, on Monday morning, there was a letter on my desk. We, the undersigned, feel that the board should take a vote and have you fired as the senior rabbi, right? And the best thing was there was a page of signatures, right? And the first 3 were sort of legible, and then the rest were just like lines, right? And they were legible signatures, but they weren't actually congregants. I couldn't recognize the names. So I was like, okay, lesson learned. Lesson learned, right? When we speak about Israel, no matter how balanced we think we are, it doesn't matter. Because people are going to react. Because Israel evokes such unbelievably strong emotions. And when people's emotions are triggered, right, we're just not the same. We're just not. And we say that about congregants who we're going to be delivering a sermon to, but the truth is we're exactly the same way. Right? When we ourselves get triggered by things, we know that our ability to process and take it in is limited. It's just the nature of human beings. And so we know that this is a topic that will trigger many. So we can approach it by saying, okay, I want to have nothing to do with this. Right? Since I can't win, right? I'm just not going to bother. And that is an approach that a number of our colleagues take. And by the way, if they know their congregation well enough, why is it so? I'm not in any way denigrating that choice. That choice, I think, in some congregations is actually appropriate because the vitriol that gets evoked is such that there is just no point, at least from the bima. Right? You might try, as you were sort of alluding to before, since there's just not enough time, you might try to create a context for a conversation for some give and take. And always, whenever I give a talk about Israel, I always sit and wait. Right? I wait at the bima until people have left the sanctuary, and then I go into the kiddush and just wait for people to come or seek certain people out. The other approach that we can take is that we can be really clear about what it is that we think. We can be really clear. and that we articulate those feelings in a manner that does not put the other side down. That I can hold a certain thought about Israel, I can hold a certain opinion about something dealing with the state of Israel, but just because I hold this here and you hold the opposite one does not mean that you are some kind of racist scum. I can hold on to an opinion, and just because we differ does not mean that you are somehow less because of it. And when we articulate our beliefs or our thoughts about Israel, we have to be absolutely clear about that. Even if we're not saying anything about a negative about another position, we have to go out of our way to say, I hold this belief, but I accept that others come from a different point of view. And this brings me just to my last comment of sort of introduction before I actually get into our text, and that is the following. If you're a rabbinical student or a rabbi who's come from JTS, I can say the following. I know how you were educated. And I can tell you that none of the people who I've ever studied with at JTS should be writing op-ed pieces for the New York Times. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the experience. However, they somehow feel that they should write op-ed pieces for the New York Times, and since the New York Times won't take them, they use the pulpit as the opportunity to express said op-ed kind of thing. I strongly recommend against it. None of us, I will venture in this room, are experts in what's going on in Israel. We shouldn't talk like we are. We shouldn't present ourselves as we are. When we speak about things that are going on in Israel, or we speak about Israel, right, being that we are here in Los Angeles, we have to do so with a deep humility that befits the knowledge that we have, the obligation that we may feel to speak, and the sense of, I've chosen to make my life here as an American Jew, and therefore when I speak about Israel, it has to be with a certain level of respect of that choice. So with that in mind, what I wanted to be able to do is share three different sources. They're not your usual sources that we present or we're taught to present in rabbinical school. And these are three different sources covering three distinct areas of friction that occur when we talk about Israel. One of the things that I learned from my own experience is that when you get talking about Israel, all of a sudden, all these different topics and different things will get kind of like loaded into it. And the thing is, each one of them is different and has a different kind of response. And so what I wanted to do is share three different pieces. And here I do so, hopefully with the words that I just said and honoring those words, with a sense of humility. I want to share with you three pieces from other people who I have read, whose opinions I respect and agree with in this case, about each one of these different dynamics that's unfolding as an American Jew as it relates to Israel. I share them with you, not because I think you need to agree with them, I happen to agree with them, but by way of saying, here's a way of approaching this, what do you think? How does this strike you? And to even say, how might we present this to others if we should choose to do so? So the three areas that I find it's helpful to break down the conversation about Israel is dealing with Israel as an American Jew within the American political landscape, dealing with Israel as an American Jew when I look at what's going on in Israel, vis-a-vis religious life there, issues of pluralism and so forth, civil rights, marriage, and so forth, and as an American Jew when I look at what's going on between Israelis and Palestinians. And so what I did is I shared an article, or a piece of an article covering each one of those. So let's look at the first one. The first thing that I want to take up is the notion of being an American Jew and talking about Israel in our current political climate. Not dealing with Israelis or anything going on in Israel per se, but just what goes on the left and right. Right? When we look right now at, for example, the left wing of the Democratic Party.
The Women's March.
Huh?
The Women's March.
Okay, so why do you mention that?
Well, my daughter and I went to the Women's March last year, and all of a sudden somebody was talking about Israel. And, you know, and not in a way that seemed to know that much about Israel.
Right. And in a way that I'm assuming was incredibly negative.
Yeah.
Right, because that's what we see. Right, in certain sectors on the left wing of our politics right now, Israel is a problem. So much so that there's actually groups who go to left-wing rallies in order to, and will carry an Israeli flag and so forth, just to say, like, look, I'm here and I'm with you and I'm Jewish. But there have been situations where they have been asked to leave said rally. Chicago's the one I was thinking of as well. Right? So we see this unbelievable dynamic, and there are many people, perhaps in this room, but there are many people who be like, wow, I'm sympathetic to a lot of what the left says, but they're so vitriolic when it comes to Israel. How can I be with that? Right? How do I navigate that? Right? By the way, the interesting thing is you got a little bit of the same problem in a slightly different way on the right. Right? Because on the right, look, you have your anti-Semites, but who else do you have on the right? Right? Are your Philo-Semites, your Israel lovers. Right? And who do they tend to be? Evangelicals. Right? And so now we have another problem. Because we look at the evangelicals and we're like, they love us too much. Right? We look at the left and we're like, they don't love us enough. Right? But they love us too much, and we appreciate their love and support, but we're a little uncomfortable for two reasons, I'll suggest, and I'll take others if you have them. But the two reasons we tend to be uncomfortable with evangelical support is, first, we have a suspicion that there's a hidden agenda. Right? We think we are just one, we're just, there's a feeling like we are but a small cog in their theological wheel.
Just
and,
suspicion.
Huh?
Just suspicion.
Just a suspicion. And at the end of the day, right, we're going to get crushed by this. Right? At the end, well, actually I say the end of the day. I meant at the end of days. Right? We're going to get crushed by this.
It's like on the right they love Israel but they hate Jews, and on the left they hate Jews.
Right. Now work on that end. That's okay. Right. But the other problem that we have with evangelicals, at least with many evangelicals, is not only we're uncomfortable with their support for Israel, but many people actually outrightly disagree with their politics.
Right. We don't align with the other non-Israel related.
Right. So it's a flip. It's this weird flip. On the left, we like the politics, but they hate Israel. On the right, they love Israel, but we hate their politics. And I say we, and I'm using it very broadly, because there's on any given issue, right? And I will make this comment any number of times I need to. On any given issue, I know that I will line up more on the right and more on the left, right? Depending on how it is. I'm not in one camp or the other. And I find most people really aren't. They have a preponderance of things that bring them this way. But on other issues, I might find political alliances with different camps. And that's, I think that's just natural. So just for the sake of simplicity, I'm using a very broad brush for this, but I understand that there are nuances with the positions. But we have this really awkward place that we now as American Jews sit, where to the left and to the right, like, how do we manage that? Because we want to be able to be involved, we want to be able to build coalitions with those with whom we agree with either their politics except Israel or, everything but their love for Israel. How do we manage that? So the first article that I wanted to share was written by Yehuda Kurtzer. He wrote it in several places, Times of Israel. It was also in the Jewish Journal, and I believe it was also in the Jerusalem Post. And he wrote it in response to Linda Sassor, and saying, basically, we're having a Linda Sassor moment. How do we process this? How do we understand this? How do we look at someone who, on one hand, represents a whole bunch of values we agree with, on the other hand, takes positions, at least vis-a-vis Israel, as well as other things that we're like, absolutely not. Now, his article uses her as the defining moment, or a moment to kind of a lens through which to look at it, but you can apply this, what he says, across the board. Does anyone care to just give a read of this source? Thanks.
Navigating between American Jews and those to the left and right. First, I suggest that we work to articulate a hierarchy of our moral commitments that we can crudely divide among what we consider moral imperatives, moral concerns, and further down the line, political preferences. Firmly entrenched ideologies, political communities, political parties, religious denominations, etc., make it easy for their adherents to conflate these three, but they are really separate. decision counts.
Right, so I want to just, the first thing is, he says, when you're looking at trying to build a coalition, when you're looking for partners, you have to understand, right, that as he says here, you've got your moral imperatives, your moral concerns, and then your political preferences, and they're not the same. Right, so hold on to those distinctions.
All of us carry around with us a short list of moral imperatives that reflect our central commitments. These are ordering principles in our political universe, and it would be difficult for us to inhabit communities or to make personal life decisions that did not follow their mandates. Separately, however, we carry around a longer list of moral concerns, the issues we care about often deeply, but which do not rise to the level of ordering our families, communities, and life choices. Most of us can tolerate relatively easily living in a community with people who do not value the same full list of moral concerns, but we struggle to do so when it comes to moral imperatives.
Okay, so how does he break down moral imperatives and moral concerns?
Imperatives are a higher,
Right.
or a deeper, more fundamental place, and then concerns are things we maybe would like to have in common with everybody, but are okay to be in a place where that's not exactly the case. There's some variety.
Right, so for yourselves, as you think about it, right, what would you for yourself in your own life qualify or categorize as a moral imperative? Right, as an organizing principle for your family, for your life, what would be one of your moral imperatives?
Freedom of religion.
Okay, freedom of religion. Right, so that's a moral imperative. Others that people might feel.
Importance of diversity,
Okay.
respecting others.
Free will for each person.
Hmm?
Free will for each person.
Free will for each person. So these would be our moral imperatives around which, right, if we were to engage with someone who did not respect those, right, it would be really tough. They're really, really tough because they're imperatives as opposed to a moral concern, right? Like, for example, I suspect there'll be some people in this room for whom minimum wage is an issue. Right? But if you were going into a political coalition with someone, right, and they did not agree with minimum wage, would you be like, oh, I cannot talk with you? Yeah, you'd be like, okay, well, we differ on this. It's a moral concern of mine. I believe people should have a living wage, right? And therefore, I believe the minimum wage needs to be raised, X, Y, and Z. But we can be in coalition together and work together, even if you have a totally different take on it, because it's a moral concern for me, not a moral imperative. Right? Moral imperatives are more deeply felt, more powerful in terms of our own lives, and are harder to compromise on. Right? Moral concerns, you can be with people who don't necessarily share them as much, or to the same extent, and still work with them. And so what he proposes, as it says in the last paragraph, on the basis of this, my suggestion for building political community is that in lieu of comprehensive or single-issue litmus tests, right, which is to say comprehensive, the two kinds of tests, comprehensive litmus test is when I agree with everything that they say, right? And political movements love this because comprehensive is another word for purity, right? It's pure. We all agree about the same thing. We all have the same principles. We all have the same beliefs. Right? And what is the advantage of a political party that's associated around purity of ideology? Right? Is its cohesiveness. Right? They will stick together. What's the disadvantage about having an ideology that requires sort of like a purity standard?
It's very narrow.
Huh?
It's very narrow.
It's very narrow. Right? You are going to shut people out. So the flip side is the single issue litmus test. Right? What do they think about Israel? Right, this is the single litmus test for a lot of Jews when it comes to Israel. What do they think about Israel? If they think positively about Israel, I support them. I'm fine with them. If they don't think positively about Israel, I don't support them. I'll have nothing to do with them. Okay, what's the problem with a single litmus test, though?
It's not so black and white.
Right?
You become narrow. You're turning your back on other moral imperatives that you've had as well.
Right. So yeah, I'm going to support this group here, even though they say the most hellacious things about other people. Right? Even though they take stances that I find absolutely repugnant. But they're good for this. I'll ignore everything else. right? So you can't, you might want to have, I only work with people and only will support people who I agree with everything. Okay, really hard. No, I'm going to do it on just this one thing. Also really
Yeah,
problematic.
but it depends on how high that one thing is on the list of your moral imperatives.
Yes.
If it's very high on, then you can't compromise. If, so it's not as nuanced quite as that. It depends how much at the center of who you are, if you would feel that you were betraying, whether it was Israel or some other issue that was really a moral imperative.
Right, so that's why he says in the following, I'm curious as to how you feel about this. On the basis of this, on this basis of understanding that I have moral imperatives and moral concerns, my suggestion for building political community is that in lieu of comprehensive or single issue litmus tests, we endeavor to follow a 2/3 and 51% rule, which would state as follows. We identify in political communities or organize for political causes with people who share or at least do not operate in contradistinction to 2/3 of our core moral imperatives and with whom we agree on a minimum of 51% of our moral concerns. Now, his percentages you don't have to take quite at face value, right? But what is he basically saying in terms of how you actually can look at the political landscape and navigate your way through?
You're not going to get everything if you want to build a coalition.
Right. You want partners for something, you're not going to get everything, right? You go to either extreme of a purity test or just a one single issue test, fine, but that's very hard and comes with all sorts of other issues. So don't be so hard, don't be so kind of
stiff-necked.
Thank you. Right? And don't be so black and white about it. Just to understand that I can be in coalition, right, with, let's say, Democrats on a whole bunch of issues that are moral imperatives to me, even if one of my other moral imperatives is about Israel, and we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And I can actually feel comfortable with evangelicals, right, because I'm not just basing my support of them on how they feel about Israel, but there's actually other issues that on moral imperatives I agree with, and on a bunch of issues I don't, but I still have enough of them so that we can be in partnership. So he's advocating for a sort of a learning to live with the gray, learning to live between the extremes. I'm sorry, I kept reading.
Yeah, it's just that I don't feel like we've had deep conversations as a society on what morality is, and to be able to clearly distinguish between a concern and an imperative. And a lot of people right now are so stuck in their worldview that anything they think about is a moral imperative, that you're evil if you don't agree with them. And it becomes hard to even play a devil's advocate and say, I don't think someone is immoral if they disagree on this.
Right. So if we were, so let's take it. So since this is a high holiday seminar with the idea of the sermons that we have to give coming up, or lessons that we're going to be sharing. So if I wanted to pick up on that point, say, look, I'd like to talk about Israel. Here's my problem. What would you say? If I give you that prompt, the problem is what?
That it's hard for us to be in community with one another when we disagree.
And therefore, what would you recommend?
Starting with an open heart and being willing to listen and acknowledge that we are all soul endowed beings.
Right. So I think that's great. So if I wanted to, if I was in the place where I wanted to use this text as a way of jumping off to talk about Israel, what I talk about is we can't all just be in our one narrow little place and not listen to one another. Right? We have to, let's talk, if we're going to have this conversation happen successfully, we have to approach it with an open heart and realize there's a difference between certain moral imperatives and moral concerns, and we do the education. Right? We're the ones, you're right, we haven't had a great conversation about it. People, everything seems to be a moral imperative. And we need to, if we're going to be talking about Israel at various points in time, be able to introduce this distinction to our congregations so that we can then build on it. And that's the one thing I didn't mention before in terms of talking about Israel. It is very helpful to look at your sermons not as episodic, but as serial. Right? Which is to say one sermon can build on the other. Right? So you can't get it all done necessarily in one sermon. You can't necessarily get it done on just a couple of Torah portions. Right? You want to lay the groundwork for how it is that you want to talk about something, then you take the time to lay that groundwork. And this would be, because I think it's a fair point, if I'm going to talk about Israel, I need to maybe introduce certain things into the lexicon of the congregation before I actually get into the conversation itself. Yeah?
Is Gertrude saying in this article that I haven't read the whole thing of that Linda Sarsour fits in this role? Like, can you tell us how he concludes since the article's about?
Right. He would say that Linda Sarsour perhaps does fit in.
Great. No, that's not trying to understand.
Yeah. So he's trying to make it so. But the thing is, what he will also say is, but it depends. Right? Because different people, right, will find that their moral imperative is more challenged by what she says. Right? What he's trying to do, though, is open up the community for the conversation to understand that, yes, someone can say something. I mean, what? You're really going to question me that Kurtz's like bona fides when it comes to Israel? No. Obviously a lover of Israel, obviously a supporter of Israel. But he looks at this and he's like, yeah, but there's a whole bunch of things there that I want to be a part of. How can I position myself so I can be within that conversation? Not everyone would necessarily be able to do so, though. And he is cognizant of that. But if you are open to it and want to be able to understand for yourself how you do it, you don't have to go through mental gymnastics. No, I hate what she says about Israel. I find it really problematic. And I will say that to anyone at any of these rallies, if it comes up, absolutely. However, that should not close me off to these other things. Yeah.
I'm almost curious because I hear you with the idea that everyone seems to act like everything is an imperative. But I'm curious how many of us have spent time presenting to congregants or to constituents or to anyone to create that list, right? Because I think that the reason that everyone can feel like everything's an imperative is because we literally one-off each topic. Like you said, episodic, when we talk one issue. Yeah. And it almost seems like one of the ways to first navigate that would to go through a process of bombarding with enough different topics that you force the people in the room to start shuffling them in their head and deciding what's imperative, what's a concern, right? Because that, I feel like that, otherwise, each time you start a sermon, right now we're talking about Israel, but really any topic, you are asking to start it polarized by saying, let's talk about one topic, giving everyone permission to say, let me forget about the rest of the topics that I care about for this moment. Right. So the question is whether or not there's time to create a space to almost overwhelm that list and force everyone to start assessing that.
Right. So I'll come back to something that you said before. I thought it was correct then, and I'd say correct now. We don't have enough time. So just that's always, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what you're saying, but we're always going to bump up against against the fact that we don't have enough time. Remember, I mean, we're often talking in sermon mode, right? Which is, I mean, some of us will speak, some of us, our congregations, they want the 25, 30-minute sermon, but let's be real, they're there for about 10, right? 10 to 12. It's nice that the congregation gives you that amount of time, but there's a whole bunch of reasons to assume that they're not there for that whole amount of time, so you have even less time than you think, right? So a lot of this has to be planting seeds. A lot of this has to be saying, this is what I'm sharing with you, but I'm open for, and I solicit your response afterwards and have an ongoing conversation to not make it seem like the final thing, and so you can kind of keep people engaged. Other questions about this? Yeah?
Just an observation from a very probably confused place. I know that when I talk about openness, I have, I'm going to just, one congregant, he's wonderful, who says, I disagree because the Orthodox, if I say be open, think about things creatively only, but the Orthodox don't. So I wonder whether this language that we're talking about is a language that we can relate to, or people who come from a liberal perspective can relate to, but people who come from a non-liberal perspective, like this is not their starting place, they cannot. I think about, when you talk about that 2/3, 1/3 rule, this is the piece that we lament with government, is that there's more of a desire to be in control than to govern. That compromise, when we talk about the art of the possible, is what has been dropped out of politics because there is no compromising. There's no, and the politicians who have stood in the middle who say, I believe in governing and I believe in compromising, and I may not agree with this Republican or this Democrat on that, but I can on this, those guys can't run for re-election because they're going to get trounced, and they're stepping out. And only when they step out can they speak the truth. So I just wonder whether if I put on the hat of being, if I was an Orthodox person, politically, religiously, whatever, everything is a moral imperative. So there is nothing that can be a moral concern. That's the way I see the world. So nothing, so the 2/3 is a different language.
Right, so in order to make sure that I'm hearing what you're saying, I just want to see, I say it doesn't apply just to the Orthodox, and I want to pull on your example.
Right.
Our political parties, we've just for the past 2 weeks seen primaries, and who have we seen win in the primaries? What do they always say? The primaries you go to the base, you go to more extremes. So this, where it becomes harder to compromise and so forth. So it's if I'm hearing you correctly, it's really not just that Orthodox, or a person who comes with an Orthodox mentality to hear us, but it's also just sort of what we're seeing. So I have nothing to say. I want to be really honest, because there is no way that anything that we're going to say is going to address the larger political issues within our country. We are not going to solve what's going on in Washington from Adad Ariel, from North Hollywood. Not going to happen. So I would recommend, even what you're saying, I agree with, right? And so I'm about to say, I say with that caveat, ignore it. It doesn't matter. What matters to me, right, when I'm speaking, are the people in my congregation. And it is my congregation that I have the best shot of actually making a difference in. And so that is the group that I'm worried about. Now, in that group, I have some people who are going to be that Orthodox kind of mentality, right? Fine. Going to have that. But many of them don't. And many of them need the guidance, they need the language, they need a way of breaking these things down so they can see how they can actually interact and not be so rigid, not be held to such categories. So I get your point, but what you're talking about, we can't solve on the broader scale. We got to work locally. And local for those of us who are pulpit rabbis, and local for us is, for those of us who are teaching in our communities, is right there. It's with the people in the room. So, sorry.
No, thank you. And I think this is brilliant to ask people to think about their moral imperatives versus their moral concerns, because you are asking people to go this way instead of go this way.
That is the idea, yeah.
But I do think there's a risk in this model, which is that you're asking people to bring a small L liberal mentality to a debate where the opponent, so to speak, may not be bringing that, right?
Right.
And so you are asking our communities, if we embrace this mentality, embrace this fluidity, you're asking them to take that risk at a time when the major trend in our political discourses is to dig in the heels and not take that risk, not risk having our ideas challenged or having our commitments, recognizing them as the fluid commitments that they are and the evolving, developing processes within us that they always have been.
So yes, absolutely right. There is a risk. There is no way to get around that risk, though. So but in saying that, I appreciate you bringing it up, because sometimes we're not quite aware of where the risk lies, and we are inviting people into a particular mindset. A mindset, by the way, that I would share is fully embraced within rabbinic tradition, and and therefore it's a risk that I think it's worth us taking. I'm going to move on to the next one because we have 2 more in 20 minutes. But the next one I can do relatively quickly, I think. So one of the other areas where we have problems when we sit as American Jews is not only as we look sort of to the left and right of us within our own political spectrums here in the United States, but also when we deal with looking at Israel from the point of view, since we mentioned it before, as a liberal. And here I'm using the word liberal not as a political term per se, in terms of I'm a liberal as opposed to conservative, but liberal in terms of how I understand and articulate the values of Western civilization. And the values of Western civilization, as it has evolved up until this point in time, has certain beliefs about civil rights, separation of church and state, freedom of expression, that when we look at Israel right now, we are uncomfortable, right? Anyone got any particular things that jump to their mind? I mean, yeah.
So we got 20 minutes.
Huh? This is the rapid fire part,
Yeah.
right? So you had the conservative rabbi who was arrested for doing a wedding. What else have you got out there that you look at from a point of view in terms of as we live our lives here as Jews within a liberal society? We look at what's going on in Israel. We're like,
the piece of wall fell because of Reform Judaism.
right? Oh, right. Right. Absolutely. How about just.
Women at the wall.
Women at the wall, absolutely, absolutely. Marriages, right? Yeah. Did you, to me, did you have to go to Cyprus? Huh?
The nation state.
Yeah.
A nation state bill and so forth. Like they're just
Conversion.
Huh?
Conversion.
Just the monopoly that the chief rabbinate has on it. I mean, and since it was mentioned already. The several, what seems to be, I think we can almost call it a trend of people who have been stopped and interrogated trying to get into the country because they have left-wing political points of view.
Peter
Bernhard, Simone Zimmerman, right? A number of people like
Sheldon
Simone,
Oh, Simone.
who is one of the founders of If Not Now. Right, so, and again, I may agree or disagree with a whole bunch of these people on a bunch of things, but I'd be like, it was shocking to me, right, that they were being stopped and interrogated at the border. Right, so we can play this game, as you said, we only have 20 minutes. We could play this game for a long time, and the thing is, I guarantee you tomorrow morning, we can play it again. Right, because there'll be something else. There will be something else. So when we look at things like that, right, how do we, as American Jews, relate to the way that Israel is setting up its religious life in this regard, right? One of the things that a colleague once said that I thought was very interesting, he said, Israel is the homeland for Jews, America is the homeland for Judaism. All right? Because of how we understand what religious life is meant to be within a liberal country, i.e. Western, right? We understand that you should have freedom to express your religion, right? Whereas in Israel, you don't have that. So we look at Israel and we are pained by that. We look at Israel and we see what goes on with the women wall and we are pained by that, right? Our children look at what's going on in Israel and they're not only pained by it, but they're like, they're turned off, right? And now it's not, what I've noticed is it filters up. Right? Because it used to be I was having these conversations. I'd have them with my kids. I'd have them with their friends. I'd have them with, teenagers, college students coming back, from college for winter break or summer break from the congregation, and I can kind of feel certain issues, right? But I notice like it's filtered up to like my peer group, right? That they keep seeing these things over and over and over again. And they don't seem to feel like isolated incidents per se, just one happening after the other, but they feel like they're almost growing. And so, this is a problem, right? How do we deal with it? And then, by the way, that's not how should we deal with it. Right now, when something goes on, and we'll just take the women of the wall, or just the holding off of the building of the prayer plaza, right? Netanyahu says, I'm gonna delay that, right? And what does the American Jewish community do? What was our response to that? Or to the conservative rabbi who got arrested?
You don't hear it.
No.
Facebook post.
Yeah, exactly. Right? You don't hear it unless you're looking at like JTA and they get a press release, right? Or it's a Facebook post, or it's strong condemnation, and some leaders are going to fly from various organizations, and they're going to talk with Netanyahu and then some other people, and there's going to be conversation, and then there's going to be a promise made of something that might change if the stars just align right, and then everyone goes home and then it doesn't change, right? And part of the reason why it doesn't change, there's two elements that come into play. Part of it is the Israelis don't care enough. I'm sorry to say it. On this issue, the Israelis just assume that the American Jews butt out. Not there. It's like, this is our life. It's like, if the Israelis really wanted, if it was really essential to them to not have the chief rabbin and have monopoly over their marriages, guess what they have to do? Vote. It's for them to vote. It's their country. We have a problem with it, and this goes to something that someone mentioned. We have a problem with it, and I think, Shana, you're talking about this, because we look at Israel as a spiritual ideal rather than a country with real politics, right? So our spiritual idealism gets tripped up when we see these things happen, and we get offended, and then we scream and yell and we post, and then we move on to the next thing. Right? And then we're surprised it doesn't change. So the first thing is to realize that the Israelis don't necessarily want it as much as we want it. And if you, I learned this with my children. I learned this with my dogs. Same lesson, right? I can't want it more than them. Whatever the it is, right? My dog has to want to do certain things. I cannot win. My children, a little more stubborn than my dogs, even worse, cannot win. I might want my sons to do X, Y, and Z, to excel in this, to work in this, to try this. I can push them to it, and I can kind of demand it of them. But if I keep demanding it, where it's coming from is external. It's not coming from them. And at the end of the day, once the external is gone, it's done. Right? So, as I said, we don't see it necessarily coming from Israel. The other thing is, and we won't take the time to read it because I do want to just get to the last source, but Danny Gordis wrote, I thought, the best article about this. The best article, right? And his point was basically this, right? American Jews, if you want to change something, you got to get dirty, right? And if you're not going to move here and vote, then how do American Jews get dirty with Israel? With our money. All right? You want to change something in Israel? Stop sending them money. Stop Israel bond appeals. Stop sending money to the hospitals. Stop flying El Al. Stop sending things to the Technion. Stop spending money. Because guess what will happen? If all of a sudden they don't have money to support their things, there's going to be a politician who's going to start paying attention. But until you're really willing to get really dirty, and politics is a full body, full contact sport. If you're not really willing to get in the game and get dirty, you will always lose. Now, whether or not we agree with the way in which he's suggesting we go about it, we can debate. However, I'm going to suggest the following, which is, if we're not willing to get dirty with it, if we're not willing to push, then there's no reason for us to get excised about it. Because it's a waste of time. It's a waste of our time. It's moral, it's just moral signaling. It's value signaling. For me to get up and give a sermon about how terrible it is that Israelis cannot marry who they want to marry and get married by whom they want to marry is just awful. What have I actually achieved with that sermon?
Frustration.
You know what? You're more generous than I, because I wouldn't have even said frustration. What have I achieved? Maybe frustration, but honestly?
Nothing.
Nothing!
Lip service.
Lip service! I have shown my congregation, wow, took a stand, look at that. He's really speaking passionately about marriage in Israel.
Or even something more negative, which is that those are the pieces that dismantle the way our congregants, any connections that they feel for Israel, that when we stand up and we take on those issues, that at the end they just kind of walk away going, okay, another reason not like Israel.
So if you stood up and said, stop sending money, you have another envelope on your desk Monday morning.
There you go.
It sounds like BTS.
Yay, oh yeah, believe me,
Sounds
believe
exactly
me.
like BTS.
Danny Gordas got a whole bunch of flack for just that reason, right? But But yeah, however, as I said, we can talk about the ways we might go about it. All I'm suggesting, right? And again, as I said before, and I'm really trying to hold to it, this is just my take on this particular dynamic. My take as I see it through the lens of, in this case, David Borders, a person who I respect, disagree with plenty, by the way, on a lot of issues, but respect a lot of what he says, a lot of his insight. And here's what he's basically saying to us as American Jews and as American leaders, right? Which is, you don't have enough skin in this game, right? And you're never going to win it. And so when we think about talking about these topics, right, I would suggest that we keep this in mind. Right? That we keep this in mind, and this tempers both what we talk about and how we talk about it. And that we consider different ways of being able to approach our congregation about Israel. Right, so for example, one of the things that I decided we're going to do this year, and we'll see how many envelopes I get, either before or after. It's going to be fascinating. We're not doing an Israel bond appeal. We're not doing an Israel bond appeal, right? For a couple of different reasons. First, we do this Israel bond appeal on Yom Kippur. That's prime time, right? I'm giving prime time to infrastructure in the state of Israel. If I was actually going to do a bond appeal of any sort, I'm going to be pushing United States government bonds because our infrastructure really needs the help. What I'm doing at the congregation is we're going to be setting up an Israel table outside both of the sanctuaries that we're going to be using, right? And we're going to have a number of different things that we're going to allow them to choose what it is that they are passionate about, what they want to give to, what they want to connect to. And it's going to cross a number of different issues, right? And it will come from some different perspectives, right? But rather than take up the time in talking about something, right, that I personally am not investing the congregation's efforts into that particular issue yet, let them choose, right? And also get feedback. What did you like? What was your issue? What were you passionate about? What would you want us as a congregation to really try to get involved in? And see how that plays out. So that's how I'm at least taking this article and this approach and processing it. And again, I leave it for you, if you agree with him, to kind of say to yourself, okay, well, if I agree with him, what does that mean in terms of how I present? And if you disagree, then bavakasha, I'm very curious if people like his, not necessarily his approach, but believe fundamentally that his underlying argument is correct or not. Thanks.
Well, I like his approach, but I think it belies a more maybe a basic issue, which is how to make Americans care. I don't think our Americans care anymore. American Jews, especially my generational peers.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I'm not sure I care anymore. I mean, there's days when I do, and there's days when I don't, and I struggle with it, and there's aspects that I could go on and on, but.
Can I just ask one clarifying question? I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say, that you don't care or your peer group doesn't care, could you just fill out for me
what I mean is, I'm not sure it's worth talking about Israel at all in today's political climate, which goes back to the first conversation to some degree, which goes back to, what are our moral imperatives as Jews living in 2018?
Okay.
Are we too broken here to be focusing on somewhere else? I mean, that's a big question that comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that's a fair point, a fair question, and when we look at
different issue, no, I'm here to listen and
no.
But what the two of you said.
Yeah.
Right, but no, I'm taking it in the spirit that I think you're offering the comment because I think it is true, right? We have a portion of our population that actually either doesn't care or is turned off and no longer cares, right? We do have a portion of the population
Just can't bear it anymore.
right, and we do have a portion of the population who are extremely invested,
Yes.
and in fact, Israel is their Judaism.
Yes.
Right,
So then blinded to all the other issues that we're frantically saying, look at how broken things are here, and they're just blind to it because
So I agree across the board. I do think at times it is important for us to, even if we're not speaking about some of these things on the high holidays, or even if we choose to feel that the pulpit is, or sermon on Shabbat morning is not the time to talk about Israel, I think the advantage of this is at least gives us a point of reference for how we feel about it and how we might approach it. So when someone comes to us and says, wait a second, why isn't the American Jewish community doing more on this? We can say, well, look, I've actually given it some thought, I've read some stuff, and I'll tell you why. And tell you why it's not going to change. And I'll tell you why it is that I'm not necessarily going to take up my precious time devoting a lot of energy to this, because we're not really invested in changing it. And I feel bad saying that, and I know that's something that a lot of our colleagues would probably find problematic, because how can we not be invested in changing in the women of the wall? It's not that I don't support women of the wall or what they're doing, but as a community itself, when we look at how we respond, it's hard to actually say that we're really putting, putting much muscle behind our words. But I personally question and don't see it, and therefore don't get necessarily as roused by the outrage that gets generated. I just am quietly pissed off myself.
But the Israeli consul 3 or 4 years ago came to AJR and said very much what you are saying. But he also said it's a waste of time for us to invest our energies in the things that Israelis don't care about, because they don't care about the wall, and they don't care about that. But what he encouraged us to do is to, as you say, invest ourselves in issues like conversion and marriage laws.
Right, and that's the thing. We have to kind of find the things that Israelis are invested in and see if we wish to support them.
That's right.
Right?
That's what
and direct our energies that way rather than bring our issues to bear on it. And I appreciate it says that the challenge is that he's saying that, I suspect, in order to kind of say, listen, still be engaged, but be engaged on terms that I'm comfortable with.
Exactly.
Right? Whereas what Danny Gordis was saying was like, okay, listen, if you don't want to be engaged on terms that they're comfortable with, then you've got to actually do. And I just don't. And judging from the response of a lot of people to what he said, people got triggered, and they didn't hear what he was saying. Because I take that from the fact that a lot of people saying, oh, he's talking about BDS. Right. To which, if you read the article, it's like, and again, it's Danny Gordis, right? Of all people, right? It's like, no, he's simply conveying lesson. He even says at the beginning, a nuanced approach. In the article, if you read it, the title is something like, he makes reference to Jonathan Swift, a nuanced approach, and he just might as well have left off the word nuanced, right? Because no one heard it. Alrighty, we have 5 minutes. I just want to share this one last source. This last source deals with when we as American Jews here look at what's going on in Israel. And we look at what's going on in Israel, and this touches in terms of issues of who we are coming as liberals, but it also goes to fundamentally how Israel talks about itself and how we relate to it. When people talk about Israel, someone's presenting, let's say, from APAC or even from J Street or from a rabbi giving an Israel talk, how long does it take for them to say, Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East? Right? How quickly does that line come up?
Usually within the first 60 seconds.
Yeah, right? When they're talking about what's going on between the Israelis and the Arabs, but Israel is the only democracy. To which, by the way, the answer is, okay, fine, maybe. Or the other thing that people say is, yeah, but you know what? Israel, right, there's definitely problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but at least they're treated better here than they would be if they were in Saudi Arabia. Right? Those are kind of some of the refrains that we hear. So first, yeah, I'm not certain Israel really qualifies as the only democracy in the Middle East. Leave that for those people who like to kind of get into that kind of nitty-gritty debate. And second, if Saudi Arabia is your bar, that's a really low bar, right? We shouldn't, and anyone is comparing the way we treat anybody to the way Saudi Arabia treats people, they've sort of lost the argument just at the outset, right? When we look at Israel,
and we look at what goes on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and this is perhaps one of the most depressing things I'm going to say, is I'm going to suggest the following, and this comes out of the quote that I share with you is from Ari Shavit's book, My Beloved Country, right? And it's a chapter that he wrote called Lida, huh?
My Promised Land.
My Promised Land, excuse me. Love Country.
You're translating.
Right. So My Promised Land. And this was a chapter that he wrote on Lida. Does anyone know where Lida is?
It's where the airport is.
Right, it's right where the airport is. Right where the airport is. So it's about southeast of Tel Aviv. It's about 10, 50, 20 miles out. And this is a part of Israel that has a long history. And it has a history where, in terms of, there's an Arab village there, right? Huh?
Talmudic history.
Yeah, oh yeah. I wasn't going that far back, but yes. There's famous conversations that occur in the upper chambers of houses in Lida for some reason. This comes up in a number of rabbinic discussions. But when Zionists first started coming to the land, Lida was a place where a number of them settled. There's a number of different stories of different things that went on there, factories that were built and so forth, and the coexistence that occurred and was manifest between the growing Jewish population in Lida, as well as the Arabs who were there prior to this current wave of Zionists coming along. Then, in 1948, when war breaks out, there is a decision made, even though it is made, and again, Ari Shavit goes through the details of this, even though no one necessarily says it directly in terms of exactly what it is they're gonna do, but however it does or doesn't get said, there ends up being a massacre there. And the town and the Arabs are deported. Right? And this has been a story that has been bubbling up in Israeli consciousness for decades. Others have written about it in terms of, there's been poems that have been written, stories, articles. He writes it in this chapter, which is a brilliant, man aside, and issues that he has, which are incredibly problematic. It's a brilliant book. This is a brilliant chapter within the book. And he basically says the following. Lida is our black box. In it lies the dark secret of Zionism. The truth is that Zionism could not bear Lida. Zionism could not bear Lida. What he's referring there is to the practical situation that Ben-Gurion faced when you're trying to create a state. It is problematic to have large sections of the population not be in favor of or supportive of the state that you are creating. So when he says Zionism couldn't bear Lida, what he's saying is that in creating the state of Israel, there was no other choice but to deport vast numbers of Arabs out of those villages and towns in order to create a somewhat cohesive, manageable state. Anyone uncomfortable yet?
Everyone.
Right? What he will then go on to note, and what he'll then go on to say in other parts, is this is a dilemma for which there is potentially no solution. Right? What we see with the nation-state bill right now, as refracted through the lens that he presents in this quote, and I'm sorry I didn't read the whole quote or allow for it, just time as such, is that when we say, can you have a state that is both Jewish and democratic, he says the answer is no. And the answer has been no forever. And the thing is, we've known that it's going to be no. They knew it in 48, that you couldn't do both. Right? And I put that out there because that is an incredibly bitter pill for many people to swallow and accept. And I'm putting that out there with the understanding that there are going to be people here who disagree with this point of view that I'm sharing. And I invite that disagreement. But I'm putting it out there because when we look at how things unfold in Israel, right, we have to see it from a historical perspective and ask ourselves, is this really possible? So when people start talking about, the demise, I think right now there was a survey that was done about the two-state solution. or the existence of two states, and it's reached its lowest point of people in favor of in Israel. The lowest point that it's ever been, right? Which means the attraction of a one-state solution is growing, but then we're really faced with this question: how do we do this? I would suggest that if one looks at the controversy that's come up over the nation-state bill, the answer is potentially that we can't. And that as we consider the way that we're going to speak about Israel and speak about these issues in the high holidays and beyond, understanding that what we hope might be cannot be is an essential thing for us to be able to grapple with. I'm sorry to just end on that. I just want to see if there's any final comments, questions, or anything on this line.
I just have one thing that's been tormenting me. If indeed there should be a Palestinian state, and you know there are all kinds of political actors that are working for that also, even though Israel may have come to the conclusion it's something that's not good, it's not going to work, right? But if there should be a Palestinian state, then would not its character be Islamic? Would they also be a democratic state? Would they want the Jews to leave? Like, I think maybe, like, if you take the long view, and if that does come to pass, and very often as I read what's happening, it seems to me it might, would it not be an Islamic state for Islamic people, like many of the other Arab states? I know when I was in cruise ship, the Israelis on the ship could not get off in Indonesia. Judaism is not an official language there, you know. So Israel is kind of isolated in protecting itself. And originally, I was very much against the nation-state bill. Now I'm beginning to see that maybe there are some circumstances in which it may be needed.
Right, so I would say that one might, and you know, it's always difficult to make, or unwise to make prediction, but at some point in time, someone's going to look back 10 years from now and they're going to look at the nation-state bill and they're going to say, yeah, at that point in time, there was, whether people were or not, a decision to emphasize and go with the Jewish over the Democrat in the way that we understand democracy. And they'll look at that, and they can look at many things. It's just political bills like that tend to become a focus when you're writing history. So it could be that that's what we're sensing and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and against the rise of neo-Nazism all around the world too.
Right.
You know, Jews need a home to go to.
Right, and that's why when I look at this particular dynamic, right, I have my own political proclivities and inclinations and so forth, but I also come to a place where I think realistically, foreseeing a solution is something that is well beyond my ability. Because what I look at is a tension that does not have a resolution that's apparent. Except for two states, which, by the way, for those of you who might be supporters of the two-state solution, which makes a lot of sense in some ways, also has all sorts of problems in terms of how it plays out. Right? And you were bringing some up. Well, what does that state look like, and what happens to the Jews who are there? So it is an immensely complex issue, but one that whatever we think we're struggling with now, what Ari Shavit and others would say is...
Wait.
Huh?
Wait.
No, wait. This stuff was there from the beginning. This is not new. These tensions have been playing out over the course of these decades. And this is but one more step in that journey, one more step in that process.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.